Hi everyone, welcome to Western Civ 2. My name is Ryan P. Johnson, and today we'll be discussing the era of European imperialism in the closing decades of the 19th century. If you're a current student, as always, there's a quiz on this material located in the Imperialism module in the course LMS. If you haven't accessed the quiz yet, please do so now and follow along. If you're not a current student of mine, welcome. I hope you like what you're about to see and hear in this video. Whatever your status, please do me a favor and like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share this video with anyone you think would enjoy it. My students have likely had enough time to get the quiz up, so let's do some history. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the conquest of African and Asian countries by European powers, the ways in which industry and imperialism fed into each other, the changes to European society, culture, and politics during the final decades of the 19th century, and finally, we'll look at challenges to European imperialism as well as the lead up to World War I. Let's begin by examining European conquests in Africa. In previous centuries, European countries viewed Africa as a source of economic gain. In the 19th century, that view began to change, and European nations began to want direct political control of Africa. Egypt serves as a good example of how this process worked. During the 1860s, both England and France invested heavily in Egypt, mainly for infrastructure projects like the Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas and reduced the time it took European ships to get to valuable lands in Asia and the Pacific. In 1879, the two European states took over Egypt's treasury, allegedly as a means of securing repayments for loans. 3 years later, supposedly in response to Egyptian nationalists calling for the ouster of any non-Egyptians, they took control over the Egyptian government. After securing political control, Egypt and France began reforming the Egyptian economy wholesale, remaking it into one that produced goods that benefited the European powers, not the Egyptian people. The same general process played out in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Many areas there were rich in natural resources like palm oil, metals, rubber, and diamonds. Imperialism in Africa was a violent process for Europeans, but especially for Africans. The Belgians, under King Leopold II, conquered the Congo and treated Africans brutally, often cutting off hands and arms for disobeying even the slightest rules imposed by the Belgians. The competition and threat of war between European nations that came with it prompted German Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck, whom we met in the previous lesson, to call a conference to peacefully settle how Africa would be divided. The Berlin Conference met in 1884 and 1885. At this conference, the European nations present decided to draw essentially straight lines across the continent, beginning from already existing coastal possessions and moving inland. This linear division divided African tribes between two different European possessions, making it difficult for those tribes to present a united resistance or keep up their normal traditions and cultural practices. In southern Africa, British businessman Cecil Rhodes began to carve out his own petty kingdom after diamonds were discovered in 1870. Dutch settlers had been in southern Africa since 1815, and their descendants, the Boers, teamed up with the British to fight wars against local African tribes such as the Zulu and the Xhosa. Rhodes's attitude toward African natives was characteristic of European views more generally. Rhodes claimed that white Europeans were simply a better race than black Africans, and that alone justified the conquest of the entire continent. Many Europeans felt Africans were either barely civilized or completely uncivilized. Everywhere Europeans went, they either upset traditional political, economic, and cultural systems, or co-opted them to strengthen their own political rule. One British governor even claimed that they should rule the land as if there were no inhabitants, essentially arguing that Europeans should feel no compunction about simply taking land and resources that belonged to other people. India was the focus of imperialism in Asia, though no spot on the continent was free from Europe's reach. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed out of resistance to British domination, with some members challenging Britain's claims to India. Britain wasn't alone in acquiring territory in Asia. France and Russia also played major roles there. France took over territory in Southeast Asia, in today's nations of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Russia, meanwhile, absorbed a number of Central Asian states on its southern border. It also sent out feelers to China and India, a move which made the Brits nervous and increased tensions between the two major European powers. One idea used to justify imperialism was social Darwinism, which was the belief that Darwin's ideas of natural selection should be applied to human societies. According to this idea, some people are simply more evolved and better adapted to survive in the world, while others are not. White Europeans, with their industrialism, sophisticated weaponry, and ocean-going ships, naturally came to believe that they were simply superior to other folks, like Africans, who did not have those things. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer, who actually coined the phrase survival of the fittest, believed this situation was natural and good. All of the violence and racism inherent in imperialism was therefore justified, at least in the eyes of social Darwinists, because Africans and other non-white people were simply lesser beings who, if they weren't strong enough to resist European incursions, deserved their fate. Some Europeans were not comfortable with the idea that imperialism engendered violence, and sought after some non-violent ways to justify conquering other peoples. The white man's burden developed to fulfill such a need. The central idea of the white man's burden was similar to that of social Darwinism, that other, non-white, non-European people were not as evolved and sophisticated as Europeans were. However, for those who believed in the white man's burden, this meant the British, French, Russians, and others playing the imperial game had a responsibility to lift these, quote, savage people up to more civilized heights. It was the duty of the more, quote, advanced races to bring their cultures, languages, histories, and technology to those they deemed inferior. Of course, the goal of the white man's burden was never to lift up other people to the same status as Europeans, but rather to elevate them just enough so they didn't pull everyone down to their level. And if native Africans and Asians complained about their traditional ways of life being upset by foreigners, that was, to the European mind, simply another example of how foolish those people were. After all, who wouldn't want to be just like Europeans? Argued the Europeans. Imperialism was also full of paradoxes. For starters, conquering other countries was supposed to be very profitable for those doing the conquering. However, such activities came with a hefty price tag. In order for England to take control of lands in Africa, it needed soldiers, ships, sailors, medicine, ammunition, weapons, clothes, food, tools to construct buildings, and administrators to run the land after it had been conquered, just for starters. This expense was passed on to the European citizens through taxation, and some nations were going into debt to fund imperial endeavors. Industry benefited from the influx of new natural resources that could be turned into new types of finished products and sold in new markets in the colonies. This in turn helped keep job growth up, supplying opportunities to workers across Europe. Those opportunities, though, were only available due to the forced labor of native Africans and Asians, who worked in near slave conditions to harvest those natural resources. The aforementioned white man's burden also convinced many Europeans that they were doing good in the world by, quote, civilizing people who desperately needed it. Yet they viewed themselves as civilized, and they used extreme violence to control other people's lands and resources, and forced them to work in horrid conditions to produce goods others enjoyed. As European armies went, so European religion went. Christian missionaries traveled to India, Japan, China, and many places in Africa, trying to convert natives to various strands of the Christian faith. These missionaries often carried the same sense of superiority with them as other foreigners, believing their religion to be superior to the beliefs of natives. Some missionaries were perfectly content to let natives be slaughtered if they refused to convert. Finally, nations like England and France, that talked a big game about liberty and freedom, were engaged in the process of taking away those things from natives in other parts of the world. I mentioned a moment ago how industry benefited from imperialism. Let's explore that topic in a bit more detail and look at the continuing development of industrialism in Europe. By the end of the 1800s, new technologies like gas-powered engines, bicycles, telephones, and widespread electricity were transforming life. The factory system spread across more of Europe as coal, iron, and steel manufacturing increased. In 1889, the Eiffel Tower in Paris opened and stands as a symbol of industry's might during the late 19th century. Agriculture was also influenced by new industrial products. Chemical fertilizers, mechanical reapers, and cream separators all revolutionized how farm labor was done. Militaries benefited from new medicines, themselves the results of new natural resources yielded by imperialism, and better weapons being produced in larger numbers. In England, innovation began to slow as old technologies and ways of doing things were held on to. The British enjoyed the profits they made from an expanding global empire and focused more on external than internal developments. Other nations, like Germany and the United States, made tremendous investments in things like natural resources and education as a way to try to catch up to and surpass Britain's industrial lead. Eastern Europe industrialized much more slowly than did Western Europe. In some countries, wealthy traditional aristocrats resented newly wealthy industrialists trying to break into their ranks. There also wasn't much interest among leaders, like Austria's royal family, to invest in national industries. In Russia, though serfdom was abolished, as we've already seen, new structures emerged that continue to tie people to the land and prevent them from moving to cities and working in factories. Despite the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, not to be confused with the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Russia was one of the least industrial developed nations in Europe. Industrial development did not always lead to booming economies. In 1873, an economic depression spread worldwide and led to 30 years of contraction. The depression was caused in part by the nature of new industries, Factories were much more expensive to set up and run than in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. This massive expense also meant those trying to start up a new factory were taking a great risk, and were threatened with losing everything should the business fold. Another cause of the Depression was that consumer spending was not keeping up with the supply of products available. As a means of saving money, many industrialists paid their workers such poor wages that they could not afford many of the products that were on the market. Money was being spent on making products that was not earned back because few of those products were being bought. Current and prospective businessmen needed ways to mitigate the risks of industrial ventures and try to ensure a steady demand for their products. They devised the limited liability corporation, cartels, and trusts to do just that. A limited liability corporation is one in which an investor is not personally responsible for a company's debts, even if it goes bankrupt. The only thing they would lose would be the amount of their investment if the company went belly up. Protection of this kind spurred investment, as those with money felt safer knowing they would not be personally ruined if a company they invested in folded. Companies also created cartels and trusts to protect their markets and ensure prices for their goods would not fall. Cartels and trusts operate basically the same way. The main difference is how they're organized. A cartel normally involves a number of companies coming together to dominate a specific market, essentially creating an economic oligarchy. Such a group could control how much of the product was produced, thereby manipulating the supply and demand of said product. Manipulating the supply and demand, in turn, manipulates the price of that product, and cartels could use their control over the resource in question to raise or lower the price at their whim. In the United States, this era of history is known for the, if you're being generous, captains of industry, such as John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Andrew Carnegie. If you're being, perhaps, a bit more realistic, those men are also known as robber barons who used trusts to corner the market on a specific product, like oil. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust either bought out or forced out nearly all competition, leaving him with such control over oil that he could dictate how much he would pay to railroad companies to ship his product. As the factory system spread worldwide through imperialism, economic depressions tended to do the same. Many European nations reacted to economic collapse by reimposing tariffs. If you'll recall, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. The idea is to make such goods more expensive compared to domestically made goods, hence making those domestically made goods more attractive to customers. Innovation was seen not just in how products were made, but also in how they were marketed and sold. Business owners began hiring managers to run different aspects of the business, such as sales and personnel. An entire new sector of employment, white-collar employment, emerged as businesses began to hire small armies of managers, secretaries, typists, and others with basic literacy and numeracy. Women entered service sector jobs. As a middle-class lifestyle became more expensive due to price inflation and children increasingly going to school rather than work, more money was needed to have a good life. Women therefore began entering the workforce despite men's negative attitudes toward women working outside of the home. Resistance to women working manifested in lower wages than what men made, as many male business owners and managers felt women simply were not fit for non-domestic work. During the late 19th century is when we see the first department stores emerge, with Wanamaker's in Philadelphia and the Bon Marché in Paris credited as the first two. Modeled after Middle Eastern bazaars, these huge buildings housed vendors of all sorts of products. Retailers displayed their products in ways that would catch the eye, enticing people to spend money on products not because they needed them, but because they wanted them. Department stores also made shopping more efficient, as consumers could purchase many items they needed in one location, as opposed to shopping at different shops specializing in a single item. New exotic products were also available as a result of imperial conquests. Let's turn our attention away from business practices and to society and culture, and how they were impacted by imperialism. Aristocrats were still the top of the social pyramid in most European nations, although wealthy businessmen increasingly wanted in. Some aristocratic families opened their ranks to millionaire business owners, seeing great benefit in new, tremendously wealthy family members. Monarchs would also ennoble the newly rich, often for a price, further expanding the number of people who ran in Europe's highest social circles. Upper-class men took advantage of imperial conquests to engage in leisurely pursuits like traveling abroad and big game hunting. Upper-class women, meanwhile, had control over households full of servants. Women also tended to control their children's lives to ensure they became friends with the right people, went to the right schools, and had paths to the right careers. Right in this context means they only hung around people of their social standing, went to exclusive private schools, and aimed for lucrative careers in government. Women also used fashion to distinguish themselves and their families from folks of other classes of society. For the working class, things were not so good. Many working people left Europe during the late 19th century for various reasons. Some left due to discrimination, such as Jews fleeing anti-Semitism, while others left because of economic distress, such as poor farmers being driven off their land so aristocratic landlords could charge new renters higher rents. Some left because of famines caused by overworked land that produced diminishing returns. Many migrants to places like the United States obtained menial, low-paying jobs, but still set aside money to send to family back home. Some European families made most of their income from money sent to them by relatives working abroad. As industrialism spread, urbanization spread with it, and many more areas across Europe saw rural to urban migration and the creation of large cities. Many migrants tried to maximize profits from both worlds by seasonally migrating. During harvest time, they'd work on farms in the countryside, and then move to cities to take temporary jobs in factories. Workers in factories had an increasingly difficult time, as new machines that could work faster sped up the pace of labor. In Eastern Europe, the putting out system was used to hire cheap labor so businessmen could save money. Turning now to the world of art. Here we also see the influence of imperialism and continuing industrialism. Plays from Henrik Ibsen and novels from Emile Zola portrayed characters that challenged norms or reflected the changing society. Ibsen depicts a woman who leaves an unhappy marriage, while Zola's characters lose their rationality in the midst of violent strikes and shopping frenzies. Some artists used mass-produced industrial products to make rustic-looking, quote, traditional artwork, while the Impressionists explored the interplay of color and light on how the viewer perceived a specific moment in time. Impressionism was in part a response to the growth of photography. Photographs portrayed people and objects in starkly realistic terms, in stunning detail. Impressionists therefore moved away from realism and towards how people subjectively see the world. Monet and Van Gogh were also both heavily influenced by Japanese styles. During the late 19th century, more people were becoming involved in the political process, so it's to that development we must now turn. Unions provided a training ground for political participation. National unions formed to fight for better wages and working conditions for their members. Many employers hated unions, viewing them as obstacles to business growth and economic progress. Some, however, saw benefit in an organization that could channel worker demands into a set that could be negotiated, rather than dealing with complaints one at a time. Women took part in unions as well, participating in strikes and other resistance to high food prices specifically. Some women even ransacked food shops that charged high prices and distributed the food to those in need. Near the end of the century, as unions grew larger, a structure emerged to give them greater strength. Full-time managers were hired whose job it was to coordinate activities and communicate with members. Political parties such as England's Labour Party and Social Democratic parties in many other European states grew out of unions and sought to pass legislation designed to help workers. People were also becoming more informed about political happenings through national newspapers. New technologies like telephones allowed reporters to convey news to their headquarters faster than ever before. This in turn led to news stories being printed nearly in real time, allowing readers to keep up with current events. In England, politicians responded to this increase in political involvement by holding mass rallies and traveling around the country, taking their message directly to the people. The Ballot Act of 1884 increased the number of men who could vote to 4.5 million, including some industrial workers. After the capture of Napoleon III by the Prussians, France's Second Empire collapsed and was replaced by the Third Republic. That government was weak, however, owing much to opposition from various groups that supported making France a monarchy. Economic crisis and corruption did not help things either, though the Third Republic would hold out until World War I. The creation of a standard, compulsory, and free education system helped generate some trust in the Republic and fueled nationalist sentiments. Other European nations like Spain and Italy remained monarchies. Some, like the Netherlands, still restricted the franchise to a small number of men. These nations often focused on building up capital cities like Rome rather than expanding political participation. In Eastern Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia were all more authoritarian than their Western European counterparts. Germany saw booming economic growth, which kept the populace complacent enough for Bismarck to outlaw all political parties other than his own. Austria-Hungary had made liberal reforms in the 1860s to increase its economic production, but by the 1880s, conservatives had returned to power. Conflict in the Balkans in the 1870s raised tensions and led to an attempt to revive the balance of European powers. In 1879, the dual alliance was signed between Germany and Austria-Hungary, with Italy being added 3 years later to create the Triple Alliance. In Russia, young people were becoming increasingly radicalized and turning to violence to achieve their political goals. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and his son, Alexander III, responded with waves of oppressive measures meant to tamp down the violence. These measures, however, only led to more radicalism and more violence. In foreign affairs, Bismarck had negotiated a treaty with the Russians in 1887, but 3 years later he was dismissed from the German government by the new ruler, William II, who let the treaty expire, leaving Russia with no friends on the continent. In the last years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, the imperial European powers faced a number of new challenges. Though they had worked together to fight African tribes, the British and the Boers soon found themselves mired in a bloody war against each other. Germany and Italy also jumped into the imperial game in Africa, but faced stiff resistance from both Africans and other European nations, keen to grab more land for themselves. Russia saw continuing domestic unrest and was exposed as weaker than many had supposed in its loss to Japan in war in 1905. Tsar Nicholas II tried to quell the internal uprisings through the creation of a representative body called the Duma, but Nicholas could, and did, dismiss it whenever he liked. That, combined with the repressive tactics of his prime minister, led to continuing unrest. In China, discontent over foreign interference led to the Boxer Rebellion. After the revolt was put down, a new dynasty called for a combination of Western technology and Chinese traditions. A rejuvenated China began to put pressure on European nations that had interests there. In India, some politicians called for non-cooperation with the British, including boycotts of British goods and work slowdowns and strikes. The British responded by creating the Muslim League, a political organization to rival the Indian National Congress and divide Muslims and Hindus. In 1908, a group of radicals called the Young Turks took over the Ottoman government, but teamed up with European nations with financial interests to brutally suppress any nationalist movements seeking independence from the empire. All of these rebellions, and more across European conquered lands, led to retaliation, repression, and more violence. Additionally, the increased tension and competition between European powers would help lead to the outbreak of World War I. In Africa, competition between the British and French nearly led to all-out war between the two. Cooler heads prevailed, and each agreed to recognize the other's imperial possessions. This agreement would serve as the basis of an eventual Anglo-French alliance. The alliance was helped along by Germany, whose ruler William II believed his nation needed to expand its reach through, quote, friendly conquests, an odd phrase, and demanded France give up possession of colonies in North Africa. France refused, and most of the European community, save for Germany's ally Austria-Hungary, sided with France. For the moment, William backed down. William was not ready to give up, however. In 1911, he sent a gunboat into the main port of one of France's African colonies, demanding territory from the French. This time, not even Austria-Hungary backed William, as the entire European community was outraged by this breach of protocol. Germany backed down once again, but the French moved closer to the British in response. The Russians, meanwhile, also spurned by William, decided perhaps the French would like to be their friends. And the two agreed to a mutual defense treaty in case either one of them was attacked by either Germany or Austria. It was clear to national leaders that Europe was dividing into two armed camps. One consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, one consisting of France and Russia, possibly with British aid, though no formal agreement had been made between the British and either the French or Russians. Adding to the already tense atmosphere were events in the Balkans, the peninsula in the southeast of Europe. In 1912 and 1913, two wars between the smaller states here changed borders and made the area a lucrative target for both Russia and Austria-Hungary, now in opposing alliances. Each nation wanted to expand its control over the Balkans for prestige, resources, control of trade routes, the usual reasons nations wanted to conquer territory at this time. Should Austria-Hungary and Russia find themselves in conflict over the Balkans, their allies would certainly get involved, leading to continent-wide war. Another factor behind the beginning of World War I was the arms race that developed in the decades prior to the war. Imperial conquests required larger armies, more weapons, and better weapons. Germany was spending 45% of its entire yearly budget on the military in the years leading up to the outbreak of war in 1914, while England was building the first entirely steel battleships, and many European nations were calling up thousands of troops to serve. New technologies like artillery that could hit targets 6 miles away, machine guns, howitzers, barbed wire, and dynamite were brought to bear. Giving such arsenals to nations already on the brink of war would ensure the deaths of millions of soldiers on the front lines. War was sparked in an unlikely place. In Sarajevo, Bosnia, the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife were touring the city to celebrate Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia. In the crowd were a number of assassins who were provided weapons and travel by the nation of Serbia, which was upset that Austria had gotten to Bosnia before it could. One of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, succeeded in killing the Archduke and his wife, setting in motion a series of events that would pull nearly all of Europe into war. Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia, who they rightly suspected was behind the murders. Serbia agreed to every demand except one, that being Austrian officials being allowed to participate in the investigation. Austria made sure it had the backing of its ally Germany, which indeed confirmed its support, and reissued the ultimatum, threatening war if its conditions were not met. Serbia stood its ground, leaving Austria no choice but to declare war on July 28, 1914. Russia, which had interests in the Balkans and wanted to protect the Serbians, who were Slavic just as Russians were, began mobilizing its armies. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was told that Russian plans called for war against both Austria and Germany. Therefore, they could not mobilize against just one without throwing all their plans into chaos. Nicholas assented, and tried to explain the situation to his cousin, Germany's William II. William told Nicholas to back down, and that if he didn't, Germany would have to begin mobilizing. Nicholas refused to stop, so Germany began mobilizing its armies and sending them to the border with Russia. France, Russia's ally, began mobilizing its forces in response to Germany's move against its friend. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia, and 2 days later declared war on France. Austria declared war on Russia on August 6th. France declared war on Germany on August 3rd, and when the German army violated Belgian neutrality on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany as well. 8 days later, both Britain and France declared war on Austria-Hungary. Italy, despite its membership in the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany, declared itself neutral when the fighting began. Thus began what would be the most catastrophic conflict the world had ever seen. That does it for our lesson on imperialism. In today's lesson, we examined the process of European conquest and challenges to that conquest. We also looked at the continuing industrialization of Europe, as well as political, social, and artistic changes happening in the late 19th century. Finally, we traveled down the road to World War I. If you have any questions about this presentation, please leave them in the comment section below, or email me if you're a current student. Further, if you'd like to know more information about the topics covered in this lesson, here's a short list of books you can find to get you started. Also, please take a moment to like and share this video and subscribe to my channel. Lastly, if you're going to comment, please do so responsibly. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you all again soon.